Okay. Hello, everyone. I would like to talk extemporaneously on a book this time around, just to see how it goes and if I can do it. Um, I don't know. I have a much higher preference for pre-writing things and recording them rather than speaking extemporaneously on certain subject matter. But I think a lot of things that I've been seeing recently, uh, H Bomber Guy's video on plagiarism, and then the Claudine Gay stuff with the Harvard professor. I think there's something happening to the idea of authenticity that is really attacking the written word, and there's no real indication from you as the viewer that I am genuine when I write my reviews. Like, I could just easily be reading them word for word from some other source. And so I think there is something to be said for the immediate seeing of a person authentically trying to reason out their ideas. Um, and so I thought maybe I would try that and see. I just have a lot of skepticism about, um, I don't want to say the written word in general, but like just the capacity for authenticity in that format. So maybe this would be something that would be a little bit more helpful to people. That's kind of the situation that we're in when I'm releasing this video in 2024. H Bomber Guy's video on plagiarism is excellent. It is like peak YouTube. I would highly recommend it. Really disconcerting. Perhaps there will be some AI solution in the future where voices can be immediately transcribed and then from there can be easily compared to the corpus of the internet. And so this will be a provisional problem in our history. We'll have to see. Today I'll be speaking about The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I've been doing research for a future Alan Wake video for the video game Alan Wake, and so it seemed apt to explore what previous indications of mental health among writers would look like. And so I thought The Bell Jar would be one of those case studies. And I tried to read The Bell Jar in 2020 and I tabled it, but recently I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of research into psychoanalysis. I've been reading works by Darian Leader. I've been reading a little Jacques Lacan. I've been reading Freud. And I've been reading the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, which is the moon to the sun of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. At least I think that's how it goes, the DSM-5. There's also the PDM, which is what I'm reading, the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. And so with that context in mind, I went back and I read The Bell Jar, and I found it to be absolutely stunning. I think it's a great case study of mental illness. I think it accurately portrays some aspects of mental illness, mostly depressive personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. And hopefully with my notes today, I can show you a little bit of what that looks like, even if you don't have that knowledge. Now, keep in mind, I am not a licensed clinician or a therapist. I just like to read this stuff. Maybe in the future, I'll be a therapist. I have thought about it. But for now, I'm just a guy with some knowledge about psychoanalysis, a very amateur to intermediate level, I would say at this point. I've read some books, right? That doesn't mean I'm an expert. I have not performed therapy, so I think a lot of I have a lot of theory, but I have not practiced. So I think that would be the most important distinction to make here. I think the best way to describe why it's so important to read The Bell Jar in the psychoanalytic lens is best described by this article that I read when doing research about The Bell Jar by Stephanie Sank, University of California, San Diego. This came out years ago, but you can find it online. It's a PDF. I would highly recommend reading the whole thing. I really enjoyed it. I get the sense that it was a dissertation or it was a thesis of some kind. I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs. First, I should probably talk about what The Bell Jar is. Written by Sylvia Plath in 1963, a month before she committed suicide. It is the story of Esther Greenwood, who spends some time in New York after having written successfully for a contest. She gets kind of an all expenses paid tour of New York along with several other young women. And after spending some time in New York, she returns home, only to find out that she does not make it into a summer writing program. And then, especially after that, is when she starts to spiral. And the book is mostly about her descent into a psychotic break. I would say like a brief or acute psychosis ensues, and how she comes out of it, and if she comes out of it, is the focus of the remainder of the book. So I think that's as much as I want to say now, just in case you might want to go in and take a look. I really enjoyed it, and I think if you have any interest in psychology or the mental health of young women, especially in the 1960s, I think in a past world, I think it's worth taking a look. Okay, I'm going to read these first 2 paragraphs, and then I'm going to explain maybe a little bit, but honestly, I think this does such a great job of explaining some of the things I want to talk about using the bell jar. So I'll begin. The bell jar is an image that readers of 20th century literature recognize all too well. The suffocating, airless enclosure of conformism making life hell for an iconic 19-year-old girl in the 1950s is on par with Holden Caulfield's Carousel. The bell jar itself, as an isolated object, is simple enough to characterize. A smothering, stiff, unbreakable case, the captive helplessly enclosed within its glass walls. However, the embedded symbolic meaning is slightly more obscure. Many critics view the bell jar as a symbol of society's stifling constraints and befuddled, mixed messages that trap Sylvia Plath's heroine, Esther Greenwood, within its glass dome. However, another often overlooked reality is that the physical, albeit metaphorical, suffocation induced by the bell jar is a direct representation of Esther's mental suffocation by the unavoidable settling of depression upon her psyche, and that this circumstance greatly alters the way in which the entire novel can and should be perceived. And I'm going to roll right into the second paragraph here. The majority of critics, who tend to view the heroine primarily through our social constraints of the 50s, generally neglect to recognize that the lineage of events within the novel are entrenched in Esther's personal psychological turmoil. Therefore, the way in which the narrative simply portrays a depressive and the way in which the narrative's construct and Esther's mental outcome is largely dependent on this fact is clearly just as pertinent a reading as that which maintains a lens of social critique. For example, in reflecting on the bell jar, Pat McPherson interprets Plath's novel solely through a lens of social criticism. Esther's suicide attempt becomes an act of retaliation against suburbia, and her ultimate release from the mental hospital on her last passed test is simply a reflection of her social and psychic maturity. Diane Bonds characterizes Esther's depression as an intolerable psychic conflict produced by trying to meet cultural expectations of women. Marjorie Perloff describes it as her human inability to cope with an unlivable situation. These analyses, though in no way discreditable, do not account for the immediate reality of Esther's illness. Critics tend to argue that society is making Esther sick. However, it is impossible to refer to Esther's perceptions, her experiences, her observations, her self-criticisms, without accounting for the fact that her perspective is unstable. It is unsurprising that Esther regards suburbia as a prison, because she is already imprisoned within her own mind. Rather than predominantly ascribing symbolic meaning to the author's use of language, objects, relationships, or attempting to understand Esther's inner turmoil through the chaos of the outside world, the novel can be cleanly outlined in terms of Esther's psychological illness and her skewed perception of the world around her. Close quote. I'll stop there. I think that really sums up so much for me. If I had a thesis or terms of engagement for my YouTube channel and why I'm doing it, it's because I think that there is so much more in regards to interdisciplinary work that really goes unsaid. Most of the time on YouTube, we get a lot of one thing. Each YouTuber is trying to do that one thing at a time, and they focus on one thing, and that makes sense because that's how you build an audience. But I think that really misses out on the ability to see more accurately, or in the greater pleasure of finding something out. And in the case of the bell jar, for a long time, there have been many interpretations of the bell jar as a social critique, as a world that is patriarchally dominant. Now, to be sure, that did happen, and Esther Greenwood in this story not only has to combat her own mind, but she also has to find a way to navigate a very bizarre world that reinforces some of the things that she holds against herself as a depressive. And we'll talk about that as we go along. I think Stephanie's essay, is not only really well written in a clear style, but the subject matter, what she's trying to say, is very pertinent even to this day. There are a lot of people who play video games and think about video games in a very narrow perspective. And I think there's got to be something to be said for an outside opinion. I have sometimes heard that you wouldn't expect this, but sometimes the best history is written by people who are not citizens of that country, for the reason that they look at the data of what's left without all of the ego attached to it. I don't know if that's true. It was kind of a thing thrown around whenever I majored in history a long time ago, but part of me wants to believe that it's true, that there is something to be said for being on the outside looking in, when it comes to perspective. So I read the novel, and I read it under this psychological lens, and I think that Sylvia Plath's best achievement is being able to render very acutely and accurately what these conditions are in such a way that empirical evidence caught up with her in the future, to the point where I think the bell jar should be required reading for a psychology major in some class as a case study. Oftentimes we get these case studies, and it's typically a clinician describing the person and describing themselves. But I think it would be good to get this inside out perspective from someone like Sylvia Plath. Now, I don't want to discredit what happened to young women in the 1950s and 60s post-war. I'm sure they had to deal with quite a bit of the bizarre behaviors of young men with PTSD, coming out of the war with psychological problems, and being able to work for the war effort, only to find that the world has changed and they just want you to go back in the house. I think that's a pretty reductive way of looking at it. I'm sure there was a lot of interesting detail that could be unfurled. But when Sylvia Plath kills herself, she puts her head in an oven, which to me is like the ultimate domestic refute, right? It is the very kitchen itself that destroys Sylvia Plath. And if you know anything about her, from what I have gathered, she was obsessed with the problem of domesticity, of being a housewife and also being free. And it seems like she never got away from that. I think there is some of that in here, and hopefully I can point that out as we go along. I won't be talking about the whole book. The goal of this from now on would be to kind of take a look at some of the details of the book and try and relate it to psychological problems, just to give you a taste of what I was looking for, and kind of what I think is the cornerstone of the novel. because I think that cornerstone happens in chapter 13. And there is a particular very small paragraph that I think is the closest we're ever going to get to an explanation of where exactly Esther's problems really began. Here at the beginning of the book, I took notes, so I may just start babbling about the notes that I took. I took notes from chapter 1 to chapter 13 but there's probably one thing after chapter 13 that I want to talk about, which is the character Joan. Here at the beginning, she says that I knew something was wrong with me that summer because all I could think about was the Rosenbergs. I will be spoiling things, so this is your last chance, because if you know anything about the Rosenbergs, you know that they're electrocuted. And something interesting that starts to happen later on in the novel is that Esther Greenwood, although Sylvia did receive electroshock therapy, Esther too starts getting electroshock therapy. And she receives a bad, quote unquote, electroshock session from a male therapist. And then later on, she receives a good electroshock session from a female therapist. I think I have some misgivings about electroshock in general. I don't really know much about the science of how it works, but I would suspect that here in this particular case, I am less sure that it has to do with the electroshock itself and how it was managed. I think it has more to do with the context of how it was administered. Because throughout the story, you get a sense of Esther splitting. And splitting is a psychological or psychoanalytic concept, either began or made famous by Melanie Klein. If you think about the history of psychoanalysis, from what I have gathered, it is Freud, but then Freud may have started it, but Melanie Klein is the one who really brought psychoanalysis into modern times. It was able to take it from the weird world of the 19th century and it modernizes it in some fabulous ways. So Melanie Klein is most famous, I think, for play therapy for children, but there's also this notion of splitting. And splitting has to do with taking the wholeness of something, the good and the bad, and rendering it apart to where you get all of the good and all of the bad, and you start to do things with it. And I think that's what happened, perhaps, with the electroshock therapy. We have a good session and we have a bad session. And over time, hopefully I can show you some more examples of how she splits. Now, splitting is very dangerous because it might produce like paranoid delusions because you start to see the world in these binary terms and the goal is to stay on the good side of everything. It produces depressive instincts within yourself because if you see the bad things in yourself, those things are permanent according to you and cannot be maintained or they can't be assuaged. And if you start to see bad things in others and you are the good person, well, then you start to get into conspiracy thinking. So there are plenty of examples of splitting that we can easily point to today to see that it's a very maladaptive, a very high cost reactionary measure by the psyche. But the Rosenbergs is how it starts. And there is something about the Rosenbergs being tarnished, about being accused of espionage and being executed for it. I think here we can see that Esther identifies with it. And that's kind of the beginning of things. I'm going to move on. She lives at the Amazon, which is a pseudonym for the Barbizon. The Barbizon back then was a women's only hotel. And here's the first example, I think, of a moment where society is reinforcing her bad ideas of the world. So she is already splitting. We've talked about that. And so now she lives in a space having won this contest. We had all won a fashion magazine contest, she says, by writing essays and stories and poems and fashion blurbs. And as prizes, they gave us jobs in New York for a month, expenses paid, and piles of free bonuses, like ballet tickets and passes to fashion shows and hairstylings at a famous expensive salon, and chances to meet people in the field of our desire and advice what to do in our particular complexions. So I still have the makeup kit they gave me. So she is being given the world in a very particular way. And then when she stays at the Amazon, a woman's only hotel, it is almost perceived like a fortress, and there are guards that maintain the sanctity or the sacredness of the fortress, right? And this is tied into Esther's own beliefs about virginity. And there is a part, you know what, I'm just going to skip to it because I think now that we're on it, two kinds, let's see, maybe that's not the way to find it. Wow, 15 examples. Okay. I'm looking for a particular moment where the Catholic Church. Oop, too far. Ooh, I know how to find it. Yep. When I was 19, pureness was the great issue. Instead of the world being divided up into Catholics and Protestants, here's more of that binary thinking, right? That's splitting, or Republicans and Democrats, or white men and black men, or even men and women. I saw the world divided into people who had slept with somebody and people who hadn't. And this seemed the only really significant difference between one and another. That to me is a big warning sign. That's a big red flag, right? There is something about her perception of losing one's virginity as a sort of tarnishment. And so she is reinforced with this by this feeling of the Amazon or the Barbizon as a way to protect young women's innocence until a certain moment when they are ready to marry, and then they are able to cross over safely the divide into married life through some symbolic gesture like marriage or a wedding. There's even a moment later on where she talks, I think at the very end, where she is surprised that she's not getting married, which leads me to believe that she's not really ready to be out. The ending is not the ending. Let me see if I can find this. I waited my turn. I had hoped my departure would do. Also, all I see is question marks. She does not know, really. Here we go. I kept shooting impatient glances at the closed boardroom door. My stocking seams were straight, my black shoes cracked but polished, and my red wool suit flamboyant as my plans, something old, something new, but I wasn't getting married. There I thought to be a ritual for being born twice, patched, retreaded, and approved for the road. I was trying to think of an appropriate one when Dr. Nolan appeared from nowhere and touched me on the shoulder. But I wasn't getting married. Like, even still at the very end of the novel, there's an inherent wish to pass over that divide. Now, why do these divides exist? Why is there splitting so erratically? It happens in chapter 13. Let's get through some of the other chapters and make our way there. Let me see what I have for notes. You can already tell that she's in the depressive state. She uses repetition. I was supposed to be something, she states twice. We can look for that and see if we can find it. I was supposed to be, here we go. Oh, 3 times. I was supposed to be having the time of my life. I was supposed to be the envy of thousands of other college girls, having won this writing contest, who wanted nothing more than to be tripping about in the same size 7 patent leather shoes. And then she gets into the details, right? She's very image obsessed, because I think her image obsession also has to do with a borderline personality organization problem. Now there is a, how do I describe this? In the PDM, what I've gathered is that borderline is used for a couple different things. So there is a borderline personality style or organization, and that is a particular style of the way a person behaves. It's a character, set of traits, set of circumstances. And then there is the borderline health register. So a person can be healthy, they can be neurotic, they can be borderline, or they can be psychotic. And so that can be very confusing right off the bat. What does borderline mean? It can either mean a state of health or it can mean a state of behavior, a state of character. And so here I'm referencing her character development. And with these borderline things, she, throughout the novel, is depressive and very down on herself. That's another personality style. That's what we're seeing here, is that she feels dissociative from what the intended experience is of going to New York and having a great time. Like, she does not fit in. She doesn't feel like she fits in with the other girls at the Amazon. She feels like she doesn't fit in her own body, which we'll talk about later if we get to it. But also, as she mentions herself and others, she is able to communicate some aspects about her own emotions, but she rarely is able to project herself out and then into other people in order to mentalize what they might be feeling. In other words, that sense of empathy is not there. She is so closed in on her own self that she is unable really to expand her worldview to other people. And so that's why it seems like she goes through a litany of people throughout this novel, and you don't really get a sense of what's going on in their lives with their behavior. Everything that they do has to do with her. She thinks of people as threatening or as a benefit. She thinks of them in very economic conditional terms, which would be hard to live with. I'm not saying here that we should like Esther. In fact, a lot of people have reviewed The Bell Jar negatively because, in all honesty, they hate Esther. I think liking or hating Esther is beside the point. I think that is the topic for another day. Instead, what I think you gain here is a sense of why someone might behave in this way, what some aspects of their history could lead someone to behave in this way. You don't have to hang out with them, right? But you do have to understand Esther by the end of the novel. I think that is a goal or a challenge that Sylvia Plath lays out for you. Moving on. We talked about the Amazon. We talked about the writing contest. We should talk about Doreen. Doreen is one of the early characters to help you get a sense of how she splits, because I guess one of my troubles was Doreen. I wonder if you talk about your friends as if they were troubles. So Doreen is an ideal Marilyn Monroe 50s woman. She's got big breasts. She's got big hips. She has that very curvy, she's not an Audrey Hepburn like Esther Greenwood. She's not a line. She's a curve. And something about how pretty she is fascinates Esther. And so Esther kind of symbiotically pairs up with Doreen, and Esther idealizes, thinks of, when splitting, thinks of Doreen and then thinks of everybody else. She thinks of Betsy. She thinks about all the innocent people who are not cynical and wise. They don't know what Doreen knows. There's this interesting thing where Esther is putting a lot of energy into Doreen, but as we see later, they go to a party. They're on their way to a party, and this guy named Lenny asks them to go to a bar instead. And this is happening in traffic. And Doreen seems kind of nervous when Lenny approaches. There's no reason to think that that Doreen is actually good at this when speaking to Lenny. So just because Esther gives Doreen something from her mind, projectively identifies something in Doreen, doesn't mean that Doreen is actually that. And as we'll see later, Esther has doubts immediately. Something else that's really interesting, I should probably say about chapter 1, is that Esther lies about what her name is. And here's an example of where she splits within herself. Doreen doesn't. I should probably get closer. Doreen doesn't lie about her name, but Esther does. My name's Ellie Higginbottom, and she'll use this name later. And it's almost like a defense where she can enter into the world of Ellie and she can be a woman without having to taint Esther. So even within her own self, you can get this sense of splitting. There is a great moment where she eventually leaves. I'm trying to find the moment where, they go back to Lenny's place and Lenny and Doreen get drunk and they kind of like roughhouse each other in a way that is, Lego, you bitch. Like, apparently Lenny stooped and Doreen went flying up onto his shoulder and her glass sailed out of her hand in a long, wide arc. Jesus. So, they're having a good time, I guess. So Esther leaves and eventually Doreen comes back into... Oh, this is an interesting paragraph. Doreen is dissolving, Lenny Shepard is dissolving, Frankie is dissolving, New York is dissolving. They are all dissolving away and none of them matter anymore. I don't know them, I've never known them, and I am very pure. All that liquor and those sticky kisses I saw and the dirt that settled on my skin on the way back is turning into something pure. So the purifying nature of a bath as holy water, right? She's obsessed with the cleanly aspects of purity. That is a continuous theme. I'm glad I caught that because that will reinforce what we see in chapter 13. All right, here we go. So she's back at the Amazon and the night maid is knocking on the door. The night maid is one of the guards. Ellie, the first voice mumbled, which is not her name. Her name is Esther. While the other voice went on hissing, Miss Greenwood, Miss Greenwood, Miss Greenwood, as if I had a split personality or something. Like, I think that's a pretty big signal, right, to as a manifestation of what is going on with the splitting, right? Miss Greenwood is the official person of the Amazon, but Ellie is kind of the dark, the black swan. And so she opens the door and Doreen comes in and she's drunk as shit and she vomits all over the floor. And there's this great moment where that is a cutoff point, right? We're talking about purity. We're talking about kind of a tarnishing. I made a decision about Doreen that night. I decided I would watch her and listen to what she said, but deep down, I would have nothing at all to do with her. Deep down, I would be loyal to Betsy and her innocent friends. It was Betsy I resembled at heart. She is telling the viewer or the reader this, but really she's telling herself this because she's realized that she's kind of over a precipice and she's entered the realm of tarnishment by going with Doreen, so she has to backtrack and she has to say, I don't want any more of this. She's like pushing that out onto Doreen and she's identifying with Betsy. So we will see that as we go along, is that she'll identify with people and then very quickly kind of use them for what she needs, and then she'll drop them and move on to somebody else because this person will do something that is not in her worldview, and it can be so minor. And that is what's interesting about someone who is undergoing mental or psychological turmoil, is the realization that the line between total psychotic break, what we see in Hollywood of people like yelling and hitting the padded walls and whatever, and then the healthy, quote unquote, people who live day by day, there is a large gap that is, to me, not really a gap at all. It is a blurring of a lot of different people who stabilize their lives, sometimes healthily. They find ways to make it work. It may be weird, it may be fetishizing, it may be insipid or narcissistic, it may be depressive, or it may be through like religiosity. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. And then some people do it really maladaptively. And to me, this would be an example of a high cost, because what it is fragmenting is her sense of stability and sense of self. And that's what you see here, is how her defenses are not going to work. And I think that is such a great thing for a future therapist to have, is the realization that some people do manage their lives with stable enough defenses. And they may be in denial about a lot of things that happened in their childhood, or as they were growing up in adolescence, some traumatic circumstances, but they're able to deny and repress and defend, either neurotically or healthily, in a way that keeps them going. And then there are some people who, like Esther, they use these defenses, and the goal of a therapist would be, I think, to try and prove to that person that the way that they manage these things, these Band-Aids, do not last for long. And so the wound, or multiple wounds, open up very quickly, right? It is not a permanent behavioral solution. Moving on. So that was chapter 1 and chapter 2. Is there anything else I want to say about those before moving on? No. Chapter 3 is Ladies' Day. She identifies with her grandfather because she likes avocados. I'm trying to think of what else. Here, Esther discusses her time in college as well. She talks about physics, chemistry, and then discusses her strange hesitation in professional life. And what did I do but balk and balk and balk like a dull cart horse? I love that detail so much, just because I really identify with it in my professional life. I feel sort of that depressive instinct to always go into a moment and have this sense of inferiority, this sense of imposter syndrome. And I think that is really important to read and commiserate with, to find cathartic. And that's another thing, I guess, about the bell jar, is that even though you can see that she's going crazy, it doesn't mean that you're not immune to sympathizing with Esther in that. Is there anything else from chapter 3? She talks about kind of physics and chemistry in college. And what's interesting is that in her worldview, she's actually quite good at physics and chemistry. You learn that she doesn't really do a whole lot, but she makes an A, and no other girls make an A. But to her, in her worldview, it's not enough, because she's so focused on the humanities. And that should have been a moment of reparative achievement for her, to realize that she can do quite a lot of things. And it would give a sense of self-worth, that she would be really identify with herself as being more powerful than she realizes. But her depressive instinct is that she gives herself really high bars to hit in only a few places. And then when she doesn't feel that, then she suffers a breakdown, or that things become even more fragmented. What else do I want to say here? That would go into her emotional state. Oftentimes in the novel, when you ask yourself, what is the range of her emotional output? It's actually quite narrow. But the day I went into physics class, it was death, right? So botany was fine because I loved cutting up leaves. So she likes botany in a morbid way, I suppose. My mind went dead. So even though she's good at physics, it doesn't seem like there is like this ceiling where she can't bring herself to enjoy, either because she's hard on herself, or just because she lacks the emotive capacity, the emotive range to bring herself to the good moments in life as well as the bad moments. She seems fixated, I guess, on the negative sphere. That would be the biggest thing, I think, that you learn in chapter 3. We can move on to chapter 4. And thinking of her boss, JC, she's thinking of her own mother, who says, wasn't much help. In the previous chapter, she referenced her grandmother and grandfather with some ambivalence. Her grandmother always said how expensive food was. Her grandfather gave her the love of avocados, so maybe it was here. There's a great moment when she sees a finger bowl. And if you've never seen a finger bowl before, you're supposed to, put your fingers in it and you use that to clean your hands. Well, she mistakenly at someone else's establishment or house or whatever thought of it as a soup, and so she drinks it because she thought that the Japanese flower blossoms or cherry blossoms on top were like some kind of additive, and it was some Japanese soup, which is like really sad. Like, have you ever known a girl to be so innocent? As Joan Didion says in Goodbye to All That, like, have you ever seen innocence quite like that? I think that's such a great, I don't know if she did this in New York, but it for me, it's like a young person in New York, like someone so naive. Do you feel good? No, I feel like hell. So they go to a movie and then they don't feel well because of the ladies' day lunch. They had food poisoning. So they all go back and they all start vomiting. And it was almost like she tries to go with Betsy and be innocent, and that doesn't help either. She still comes home and vomits just like Doreen. You could equate it like that. I'm not sure if Esther mentions that specifically, but implicitly for the reader, you gain a sense that through the metaphor of vomiting, that Esther's defenses are not working. What's the matter with me? Poisoned, she said briefly. Poisoned, the lot of you. I never even seen anything like it. Sick, sick, sick. Whatever have you young ladies been stuffing yourselves with? So just the way that they're being described like this, poisoned the whole lot of you. It's not either or, right? It's you've all been poisoned. And that may be true for the sake of the novel, but I think it's metaphorically, you can expand it. Hot dogs. I love hot dogs. Chapter 5. Moving on. She receives a phone call from a Constantine, and Esther could hear in his foreign accent the words of another lady. Hey, Mrs. Willard. This is really fascinating. So then I remember Mrs. Willard and her simultaneous interpreter. So something about the unconscious is that it's timeless, and it places past, present, and future, I guess, in the sense of like the superego, like our future desires, or curtailing your present behavior for future circumstances. So in a person's life, they have to build a cohesive enough self in order to understand past, present, and future. And there is something about Esther's behavior that is very tied to the unconscious in the sense that it's timeless. And you get that in the writing. Sylvia Plath wrote this very quickly. She had a breakthrough moment, and she wrote it exhaustively fast. And so I think because of that, you get some rawness in the text. We don't really know, I don't think, who Mrs. Willard is. You would on our reread, of course. There's this great moment. Let me see if I can find it. So she's having a conversation with Constantine, and I have no idea how Constantine. He's an interpreter for the UN, and he wants to take her there on a date. And there's this moment when they're speaking, and he's basically asking her out, but Esther interprets it in a different way. There's a silence. Then he said, "Maybe you would like a bite to eat afterward." I detected the vocabulary of Mrs. Willard, and my heart sank. Mrs. Willard always invited you for a bite to eat. I remembered that this man had been a guest at Mrs. Willard's house when he first came to America. Mrs. Willard had one of these arrangements where you open your house to foreigners, and then when you go abroad, they open their houses to you. I now saw quite clearly that Mrs. Willard had simply traded her open house in Russia for my bite to eat in New York. Oh. Okay, so even if they knew each other, for the record, Mrs. Willard is Buddy Willard's mother, who could presumably be Esther Greenwood's future husband. They dated in college. They have a history. They have a relationship, and Mrs. Willard could be her future mother-in-law. And there is a lot of animosity they're inherent just because mothers-in-law, what are you going to do? So this to me is such a bizarre conflation of personages because she dismisses Constantine because of a phrase, and a bite to eat is not too strange of a term. It's actually quite general, but she pinpoints it to Mrs. Willard and immediately comes up with this grand theory about how maybe Constantine was coached or whatever. But from then on, she has some wariness towards Constantine even before the date has begun. And that would be really difficult to imagine for people who don't understand why a person responds to them so cynically. This could be an example to help people understand a little more. This is, I suppose, an example of transference. I'm not quite sure if that would be the particular term. But just the way that she sees Mrs. Willard in Constantine, I think is really bizarre and really interesting. Throughout the novel, Esther will have a difficulty with recognizing people as whole and cohesive. She will see other people delusionally who are not the people that she thinks they are. Equally, she'll have a problem with prognosia. I'm not sure what's the term for when you have a difficulty recognizing the idiosyncratic features of a face so that you know who that person is. They're just like an emoji, basically. There's just the flat color and then like black dots for eyes, for example, and then like a very thin mouth. And this is a real thing. People have neuroscientific problems with this, or neurological problems with this. But I think it can happen too in acute psychosis. I could be wrong. But throughout the book, Esther has a problem with people. And it's not just the inside of people. It's the outer ways of recognizing who they are. Because right now, there is a bit of Mrs. Willard inside of Constantine right now, when in reality, they probably know either very little of each other or nothing at all. Another thing I want to mention in this chapter is that Buddy Willard was a hypocrite. So again, that sense of purity of people who have had sex and lost their virginity and people who haven't. Buddy Willard was somebody that Esther was planning on marrying. He's so clean. There's a moment later where older women really want Esther to get with Buddy because of his cleanliness. They like the way he's put together. He's athletic. He's smart. He's got all the things. But Esther thinks that Buddy is a hypocrite and will not marry him or get with him because he has already had sex with some waitress that he worked with at one time or another. And in Esther's eyes, that's a tarnishing. And she calls Buddy a hypocrite for it because he parades himself as a clean person when she knows that he is anything but, according to her eyes, that it's over. That's another thing I wanted to say about the chapter. And then again, there's something else about this is a great textbook example of the differences between Esther and someone like Doreen. So Doreen, I'm not sure about her taste in men, but from what I can see, she's a perfectly normal, excited New York young woman who wants to experience the world and have a good time. And to be young in New York is one of the best things to do, especially in the 50s after the war. So Esther, again, is having a problem with New York and having a problem with being there because she hates tipping, which is so hilarious. I decided not to go down to the cafeteria for breakfast. It would only mean getting dressed. And what was the point of getting dressed if you were staying in bed for the morning? I could have called down and asked for a breakfast tray in my room, I guess. But then I would have to tip the person who brought it up, and I never knew how much to tip. I'd had some very upsetting experiences trying to tip people in New York. So she talks about two experiences. She talks about a bellhop, and then she talks about a taxi driver. And this leads to a pervasive, constant sense that she never knows how to deal with tipping. Now, Doreen turns it into humor. You ninny, he wanted his tip. So she is able to take this particular moment with the bellhop, and she's able to displace it and turn it into a joke. Later on, there's a problem with a cab driver where the cab driver gets really in her face, supposedly, And Doreen said 10% was what you should tip a person, but I somehow never had the right change. And I'd have felt awfully silly giving somebody $50 and saying 15 cents of this is a tip for you. Please give me 35 cents back, right? So that sense of compromise, right, of having to have a conversation about let's take this wholeness and let's divide it into smaller parts, right? Let's fragment it. Let's tarnish it. She does not want to do that, right? She likes the wholeness of things. She wants to be able to hand somebody exactly the right tip and to not have to deal with the repercussions as a result. So happens again with the cab driver. Cab driver apparently says, "Lady, I got to live like you and everybody else," in a loud voice, which scared me so much I broke into a run. Now, Doreen is able to handle this in a healthy way. She said the tipping percentage might well have risen from 10 to 15%. Either that or the particular cab driver was an out-and-out louse, right? Either he could have been an asshole or tipping may have changed. It's a very easy thing to do in one's mind. And what is so great about that for Doreen is that Doreen categorizes that in her mind as just another incident that is something to remark upon in the future, but it's not something to ruminate or fixate on. And Esther cannot seem to get past that. To her, she's like, well, I'm just not going to tip. So that lack of ambivalence is a huge warning sign to me. Now, a lot of people have this problem, not necessarily with tipping, but in other areas of life. I think it's sort of undeniable that there will be a traumatizing or fixating moment that you will develop a repression or a symptom of later on, just because maybe that moment hit you in just such a way. But it's just another great example of Esther's problems with relating to people and relating to her own mind. What else do I want to say about? The fig story. Does that happen in chapter 5? Figs are a huge... Oh, God. Can I do quotation marks? I cannot do quotation marks. You've got to be kidding me. All right. So fig, F-I-G, is used for a lot of other things. So this is going to be difficult to come to terms with. Fig tree. You know what? We ended up right where we were before. That's embarrassing. Figs come up again and again as what we might say is a leitmotif in literature studies or literary studies. But here we can see that it has some psychological implications. So the first of several instances of figs. I flipped through one story after another until finally I came to a story about a fig tree. This fig tree grew on a green lawn between the house of a Jewish man and a convent, and the Jewish man and a beautiful dark nun kept meeting at the tree to pick the ripe figs, until one day they saw an egg hatching in a bird's nest on a branch of the tree. As they watched the little bird peck its way out of the egg, they touched the backs of their hands together, and then the nun didn't come out to pick figs with the Jewish man anymore, but a mean-faced Catholic kitchen maid came back to pick them instead and counted up the figs. The man picked after they were both through to be sure he hadn't picked any more than she had, and the man was furious. I thought it was a lovely story, especially the part about the fig tree in winter under the snow, and then the fig tree in spring with all the green fruit. So we have the splitting, right? We have the dour, bad breast. That's a term in psychoanalysis. The tree in winter, and then the verdant tree in spring. I felt sorry when I came to the last page, I wanted to crawl in between those black lines of print the way you crawl through a fence. The details are so good. And go to sleep under that beautiful big green fig tree. It seemed to me that Buddy and Willard and I were like that Jewish man and that nun. Although, of course, we weren't Jewish or Catholic, but Unitarian. We had met together under our own imaginary fig tree. What we had seen wasn't a bird coming out of an egg, but a baby coming out of a woman. And then something awful happened, and we went our separate ways. There's quite a lot about babies that I'm not going to get into here with regard to Esther and the bell jar, but I think that the book is also rich in other ways. And so if you were to read this, I would highly recommend paying attention to how the aspect of childbirth is equated with sexual congress, so to speak. Fig trees again. Is there perhaps a way we can just skip to the next moment of where fig trees are mentioned? Here it is again. So it comes up again. I'm not sure if it's the same chapter. I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs there were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one they plopped to the ground at my feet. Again, that tarnishing, but here it isn't in the bipolar register, it's in the depressive position of realizing that the way that she views herself is not working anymore. The one thing I was good at was winning scholarships and prizes, and that era was coming to an end. I felt like a racehorse in a world without racetracks, where a champion college footballer suddenly confronted by Wall Street in a business suit, his days of glory shrunk to a little gold cup on his mantle with a date engraved on it like the date on a tombstone. If you've ever played a board game with your family over the holidays and your mother is constantly wondering what her role is in the board game, it's something like this. Sometimes there are people who want to know what their role is before they enter it, rather than the other way around, right? To create the role. And so I think for a lot of women back then, there is sort of a plateauing moment where once you are done with your blooming, quote unquote, it's just expected that you either find a man or you become all of these different paths, right? You can't, in this scenario, according to Esther, you can't mash two figs together. Even the way that she metaphorizes it has complications, because in this scenario, you can't be two of these things. You just choose one, and that is the fig that you have. So that worldview is being tarnished because she wants all of them. She wants to take a bite out of all of them, which you could presumably do a couple of these. I wouldn't say you'd be able to do all of them, but there is an opportunity for adventure and domesticity. You would probably be looked down upon by society. There is a chance of that. But there's no quarter, it's all or nothing. Let's see. I kind of just want to fast forward to chapter 13 because I think I've made my point about the two main topics that I wanted to talk about, her depressiveness and her borderline behavior. And I wanted to try and show why that might be the case. So let's do it. Let's go to chapter 13 because this is already an hour long and I don't want to waste any more of your time. So chapter 13 is where she has a huge like she has a psychotic break because of not making the Harvard summer writing program. That's the beginning of it. But I think that chapter 13 does something even more important, and I'd like to talk about it. She says at one point that she has never been happy after age 9 because that is when her father died. And people can bounce back from the death of a parent early in age. It is difficult, and I think there is always going to be some residual problems or complications because it's a hard thing to have happen. But I think the manner in which it happens really says a lot about why Esther behaves the way that she does right now. So she's back home and she decides to visit her father's grave. Good Lord. I believe chapter 13 is also where she decides to attempt suicide. Of course, his mother killed him. Does your father happen to live near Boston? Some kind of obsession with the father. That morning I tried to hang myself. Only my case was incurable. That permanence again. Good Lord. The more hopeless you were, the further away they hid you. I think that is such an indicting Foucault-like phrase about the Great Confinement in the early to mid 20th century, that we went to this subduing of crazy people, quote unquote. She goes to work at the hospital. Okay, yeah. So there's a great moment. We'll just have one more example. So she volunteers at the hospital and she's taking flowers to patients. And when she's arranging these flowers, she decides to get any flowers that are untarnished, to leave them there, and then to get rid of the flowers that she thinks are not good. Plenty of people do this, right? Plenty of people rearrange flowers according to the healthy ones that manage to survive. But when she does it, her expectations of what a healthy flower is are so high that she demolishes these flowers. Hey, where's my larkspur? A large flabby lady from across the ward raked me with an eagle eye. The sharp-faced blonde went over the trolley. Here are my yellow roses, she said, but they're all mixed up with some lousy iris. I was opening my mouth to explain that I had thrown a bunch of dead larkspur in the sink and that some of the vases we had weeded out looked skimpy. There were so few flowers left, so I had joined a few of the bouquets together to fill them out. When the swinging door flew open and a nurse stalked in to see what the commotion was. Listen, nurse, I had this big bunch of larkspur Larry brought last night. She's lost up my yellow roses. So she doesn't understand that these are multiple patients' flowers. And I don't even think this was her job, right? But she can't help herself. She has to get rid of those flowers. So this leads straight into what I think is the most important part of the entire novel. And then I'll end there. I want to talk about Joan. I may briefly mention Joan, but I think I've done enough for today. Which way is the graveyard? The Italian in the black leather jacket stopped and pointed down an alley behind the white Methodist church. I remembered the Methodist church. I had been a Methodist for the first 9 years of my life before my father died and we moved and turned Unitarian. My mother had been a Catholic before she was a Methodist. My grandmother, my grandfather, and my Aunt Libby were all still Catholics. My Aunt Libby had broken away from Catholic Church at the same time my mother did. Blah, blah, blah. I don't believe in life after death, the virgin birth, or whatever. Only trouble was church, even the Catholic Church. Blah, 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 blah. Here it is. So she's going to her father's grave. She has a black veil. I tugged my black veil down to my chin and strode in through the wrought iron gates. I thought it odd that in all the time my father had been buried in this graveyard, none of us had ever visited him. My mother hadn't let us come to his funeral because we were only children then, and he had died in the hospital. So the graveyard and even his death had always seemed unreal to me. I had a great yearning, lately, to pay my father back for all the years of neglect and start tending his grave. I had always been my father's favorite, and it seemed fitting I should take on a mourning my mother had never bothered with. I thought that if my father hadn't died, he would have taught me all about insects, which was his specialty at the university. He would have also taught me German and Greek and Latin, which he knew, and perhaps I would be a Lutheran. My father had been a Lutheran in Wisconsin, but they were out of style in New England. So he had become a lapsed Lutheran, and then my mother said, a bitter atheist. The graveyard disappointed me. It lay at the outskirts of the town on low ground, like a rubbish dump. And as I walked up and down the gravel paths, I could smell the stagnant salt marshes in the distance. The old part of the graveyard was all right, with its worn flat stones and lichen-bitten monuments, but I soon saw my father must be buried in the modern parts with dates in the 1940s. The stones in the modern part were crude and cheap, and here and there a grave was rimmed with marble, like an oblong bathtub full of dirt, and rusty metal containers stuck up about where the person's navel would be, full of plastic flowers. A fine drizzle started drifting down from the gray sky, and I grew very depressed. I couldn't find my father anywhere. Low, shaggy clouds scudded over that part of the horizon where the sea lay. Behind the marshes and the beach shanty settlements, and raindrops darkened the black mackintosh I had bought that morning. A clammy dampness sank through to my skin. I asked the salesgirl, "Is it water repellent?" And she had said, "No raincoat is ever water repellent. It's shower-proofed." And when I asked what shower-proofed was, she told me I'd better buy an umbrella. But I had enough money for an umbrella. Well, with bus fare in and out of Boston and peanuts and newspapers and abnormal psychology books and trips to my old hometown by the sea, my New York fund was almost exhausted. I decided there was no more money in my bank account. I would do it. And that morning I spent the last of it on that black raincoat. Then I saw my father's gravestone. It was crowded right up by another gravestone, head to head, the way people are crowded in a charity ward when there isn't enough space. The stone was of a mottled pink marble, like canned salmon, and all there was on it was my father's name, and under it 2 dates, separated by a little dash. At the foot of the stone I arranged the rainy armful of azaleas I had picked from a bush at the gateway of the graveyard. Then my legs folded under me, and I sat down in the sopping grass. I couldn't understand why I was crying so hard. Then I remembered that I had never cried for my father's death. My mother hadn't cried either. She had just smiled and said what a merciful thing it was for him he had died, because if he had lived, he would have been crippled and an invalid for life, and he couldn't have stood that. He would have rather died than had that happen. I laid my face to the smooth face of the marble and howled my loss into the cold salt rain. Holy shit. As far as literature goes, there are a few moments really that do it quite like that, in such a poignant way. So much of Esther's problems are in that moment, especially this moment. How else can we explain the feeling of tarnishment, where it would be better to get rid of everything, to split into all good or all bad, and to have it separated, than to deal with ambivalence and complication? Then in this moment right here with the father, if he had lived, he would have been crippled and an invalid for life, and he couldn't have stood that. So I think that is sort of the latent content. I think that the manifest content here is the obvious, which is that she never got a chance to properly mourn for his death. So there's a pairing. There's the crippling aspect, and then there is the separation of a death without any symbolism, any symbolic ritual. There is just the presence of the father, and then the absence of the father. And that to me those are the ingredients that help to make up why her coping mechanisms are so bad. Not to mention that her obsession with images, when she goes to her father's grave, she wears all black because she wants to look the part, right? I don't know really what to make of that necessarily. I love this. She says, I laid my face to the smooth face of the marble. It is almost like she is trying to give her father a hug, to embrace her father and have their faces connect, right? Like, why would you call the marble a face if not that? And I think that is deeply sad that she never really got a chance to mourn the loss of her father. And because of that, there is just this massive chasm. And I think what's really bizarre is her mother's behavior afterwards, right? She had just smiled and said what a merciful thing it was for him. He had died. It's like total denial. So like maybe it's a 3-part ingredient. So there's the opening of the chasm, and then there's the way that the chasm looks, and then how a person creates a bridge over that chasm. To me, this is the most important part. Like, I'm not sure if there are big breakthroughs in real life patients. I think there are small things that a person realizes that they do that they can learn to do better as they go through therapy, years and years of the talking cure. But I think for the scope of literature, this is the closest moment that we get, in my opinion, to a climax. I think it is so gripping, and it's amazing how cohesive or coherent a work this is. I think a lot of people would find this book to be rather bizarre, not having any sort of psychological background. But from where I'm sitting, this to me is the most important moment. There's one more thing I want to talk about, which is the character of Joan. Joan appears later. Joan dates Buddy for a while, and then they both end up in a sanatorium or a psych ward or an asylum. And here's another example of how Esther can't seem to get into people's heads, and she sort of only hears what she wants to from people. I'm trying to find a particular phrase. Sometimes oh, there it is. It's incredible what the memory remembers. So there's a really bizarre moment at the end of the book where she develops this relationship with Joan, and she really destroys Joan with a phrase. And Joan eventually commits suicide. She hangs herself. And it's almost like Esther criticizes herself for trying to commit suicide and not doing it, that she couldn't do it right, which is so depressive that you are blaming yourself for botching a suicide attempt, right? Like, how low can you be to be like criticizing yourself for not doing it right? And it's almost like she still wants the suicide moment, but instead she externalizes it and projects it into Joan. Joan kills herself. And that is almost like the Esther that was for Buddy, who Esther is now, is almost like that person was put into Joan, and then Joan dies, and that takes care of her relationship with Buddy. I may be looking into it too much, but that is the feeling. There's a great moment that Esther herself admits, and that's the thing I wanted to talk about more. And it's here. I'm not sure what chapter this is. Sometimes I wondered if I had made Joan up. Other times I wondered if she would continue to pop in at every crisis of my life to remind me of what I had been and what I had been through, and carry on her own separate but similar crisis under my nose. I think to me, I could see multiple possibilities. Maybe Joan is a fictional character, and she creates this delusional person as a mirror or representation for, this separate but similar crisis. 2 is that Esther, when she sees people in a psychotic state or in a borderline state, she is unable, again, like we've talked about before, to see into somebody else, and only pulls from them what she needs to survive for her defenses. 3 is that she is a real person, and she is going through a similar crisis, and these 2 situations are totally separate, but they share something together, and Joan isn't able to pull things together. She eventually kills herself, and Esther, for the scope of this story, doesn't. And that's kind of symbolic in its own way, that it would be, I guess, some kind of breakthrough that Esther survived. I would not be too confident about that. I will end with this last part, which I think is towards the end of the book, and is very alarming for anybody who thinks that Esther made it. I think that Esther still has a long way to go. I don't really trust, and she does not really trust. But in spite of Dr. Nolan's reassurances, I was scared to death. I had hoped at my departure I would feel sure and knowledgeable about everything that lay ahead. After all, I had been analyzed. Instead, all I could see were question marks. That was right before I read that thing earlier. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think what was really discouraging, well, maybe not discouraging, from what I gathered in the psychodynamic manual, that therapies for borderline patients tend to have to really adapt themselves to the person. And they have to become individuated in a way that a manual has a hard time addressing. And I think that's the beauty of psychoanalysis. And I think that is the thing that keeps it from becoming a full-blown science, is that people are so different. People are really original in the way that they form things. And the reason why we keep reading fiction and keep reading novels about characters or with characters in them is because of those ways that they organize their lives. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's also a harrowing thing. And so I think if you have any interest in characterization, you should give The Bell Jar a chance. So thank you if you've made it up to this point. I'm very grateful. I love it. I loved this book. It shot up immediately to be one of my favorite novels in recent times that I've read, not necessarily that have been published. I can see myself returning to this as I read more of psychoanalysis to try and find those little details. I do think it is an accurate portrayal. And I don't know. I wish we knew more now, and I wish we had a better support system for women like Sylvia Plath and for women like Esther Greenwood than we did back then, because maybe crisis could have been averted. I don't know. But yeah, please give The Bell Jar a chance. If you made it through this entire video, you kind of know what to expect. And maybe this was just for me to organize my thoughts. I will catch you in the next one. I don't know if I will continue to do this format for book reviews, just because, I don't know, the feeling that I get is that I rambled and that I didn't ramble well. Part of me wants to keep book reviews really tight, condensed, so that I don't waste a viewer's time. I can just give them my 2 cents on how I felt about a book and why I felt that way, without stringing them along. Anyway, stuff to think about. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day.